Thanks again, Enrique. We'll directly start asking our questions. So
yeah, that's fine. If the audio is fine, then we can go ahead.
Yep. So yeah, I mean, first of all, can you shortly explain what the term cultural transduction is?
Okay, well, cultural transduction is drawn from the concept of transduction that is used both in genetics and in engineering to mean that there's a transfer of elements. In genetics, it's usually between a cell and another cell, and it's the transfer of DNA that is done by a viral agent. And in engineering, it's a transformation of the phenomenon of energy depending on what type of space or what type of environment it is existing. So how energy transforms as it moves from one environment to a different one. So I use that metaphor in terms of culture, of when we are trying to transfer cultural products between one space or one market into another, how it has to change or adapt or do that other market. So cultural transduction is when a certain cultural or media product is travels between different markets, between different cultural markets, and how that implies a change in how that cultural product is done or in the characteristics of the product.
You note that the developed countries still dominate the global cultural service exports. Are there any indicators that would signal that this imbalance is shifting?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that the imbalance is directly shifting, but at least you can see other ways in which products are traded that are not exclusively from a core market to peripheral markets, so or to larger economies that have stronger media to other places, but rather that there are other ways in which products are also traded that also exist in a sense. An interesting example that I used to bring up is when we think of Netflix and we see that some of the things that are produced and distributed in Netflix are obviously mainly from the US, but you also have, in a second level, you have South Korea as one of the ones that produces the most and that is exporting that kind of production. And then third, you would have Colombia. So you see countries that are not necessarily what first comes to mind when you think about fiction narratives. So yes, the US comes up first because of Hollywood, but you wouldn't necessarily expect the other ones to be South Korea and Colombia as opposed to, the UK, for instance, or Australia. We're thinking about the Anglo-Saxon kind of axis on audiovisual exports. So yeah, you see that, and in different kinds of media, so let's say with video games, with web comics, with other types of products, and you can see that there's also other flows. I'm not saying that necessarily that implies that the strongest media flow, that is the one coming from the United States, is not there, because it's still there, but that you can see that there are many other ways in which media and cultural products flow that complement the vision. So we can talk about asymmetrical interdependence, as Joe Strauber used to say, or we could also consider that there's different ways in which you can allow for things to come or to participate. And markets shift as well. So markets such as the telenovela market in Latin America that was dominated by Brazil and Mexico, then you could have a lot of productions coming from Turkey or coming from Korea as well. So you see, even markets in which you expected that the internal production was sufficient and that was what people were consuming, then you can also see other entrants into those markets. So that just highlights how the interaction of different people has shaped or has changed the way in which we consume media.
How do cultural proximity and linguistic ties influence the likelihood of media products traveling successfully between markets?
Well, definitely, I mean, cultural proximity simplifies a lot of the elements that when you're trying to get to other cultural products, then you need to relate in a certain way to what the content is offering you. So it's more likely that you're going to acquire or watch shows from a nearby market. That's what happened in Latin America in general. You had a lot of telenovelas going to different countries from Mexico or from Brazil or from Venezuela at different points in time, and then Colombia. And also the exchange of music, rock music from Argentina in all of Latin America. So you have all of those influences that go around the linguistic, the geolinguistic group, but also cultural ties, because you can imagine with Brazil, Portuguese, it's a different language, but still it's close enough in the elements that they portray, in the stories that they tell, that that would link. So you have that. Sometimes you don't realize, but there's other cultural that connect in that way as well. So it's not as surprising that the telenovelas that are coming up are from Turkey or from South Korea rather than, let's say, Japan. And it's because in Korea, you also had at least a large percentage of the population, I think it's about 30%, who are Catholics. So Catholicism and Christian religions are much closer to what you would find in Korean telenovelas than what you would see in Japan. So definitely some values are easier to connect in that sense. And then are elements that you can see them when you transform the products. You realize which kind of other markets that might seem distant in certain concepts might be closer in other cultural elements, in how family, how central family is to your social cohesion, for instance. Yeah, how common is it for families to still stick together, which is something that is more of a trait in certain parts of the world rather than, let's say, in Scandinavia or in Northern Europe. Yep. So those things connect. And then cultural proximity is how we connect to others, how we feel like others are proximate to us because of similar experiences or similar ways of seeing the world. And language, obviously, is one of the main ones there.
What makes a media product inherently more shareable or universal in your view, and what balance do you recommend between like maintaining product authenticity and making it culturally accessible?
Yeah, here it depends on how you think about the universality. So it's absolutely universal, so that all the cultures in the world would take it in the same way. That's very hard, even though there are certain issues or topics, so certain kind of love stories are understood, let's say, by all different cultures. There would be something that all the different cultures would accept as something that they would like to see as a relationship between, mother and daughter, father and son. Those kind of stories, they resonate with all the cultures. So there are topics that are more common to all the cultures than other types of topics. But if you want to avoid many cultural elements, then first there are elements within your story. That is how specific your story is to a place. The more specific you make your story to a place, so dependent on elements of that place, the harder it would be for that story to travel, unless, like New York City, of that place, even if we haven't been there. So that's one of the main things, and that's why many of the productions, sometimes they try to emulate, or they try to show you that you're in New York, even though it's not made in New York. It's just because people have a lot of visual references of New York. So to make it more universal, you use tropes that people already know a lot about. I talk about the game Kingdom Rush that is made by a group of developers in Montevideo, in Uruguay. And the way they did it is they used a lot of the fantasy tropes that we all know about, and kind of those images of the elves and the orcs and the monsters and all of that exists through many other forms of media that has already become kind of more or less universal, so people understand it. And fantasy and sci-fi are usually seen genres that are easier to transfer because they don't depend as much on current reality. So the more you can create other worlds in which that is not relevant, it's a bit easier for you to accept because you don't pinpoint them or you don't connect them directly to something that is out there. And funnily enough, that's a big difference that they used to say about why it was a bit more appealing in that sense, Star Wars, than Star Trek, because Star Wars is totally disconnected. It's a whole new universe, whereas Star Trek was connected to the history of Earth. So even though it was removed, which made it easier to trade because you can say whatever has happened in those hundreds of years, still had to have some connection to a moment, to a point in history. And that has an impact. So when you're creating a story that is negentropic, so that the story within itself makes sense. So it creates a world that is contained and the story makes sense within itself, but it's separated from all of those markers that are very specific to a place or very specific to a time. Then that helps you having those stories travel. Using the most common tropes or the most common ways of portraying things always helps. So if I try to make a 5-hour film, is to travel than if I do it and it's 2 hours or an hour and a half, because that's already something that people are used to. Obviously, you can innovate, and that can help sometimes. And when they started creating the first web comics that were scrolled down on your phone, well, you needed to have the smartphone for that to work. But the ones you movement that you could do in order to continue to the story, then that became the norm. And then now everywhere you can find this type of web comics. I mean, you could have gone any way, but you just went with the sliding up or down as a way of following the story. So in general, what I would say is to remove as many very specific elements unless you think your audience already knows a lot about that, which is something that you can use. I mean, if I want to make it universal for most of Asia, then there's a lot of tropes and a lot of elements that they will all recognize that might not be recognizable elsewhere. So you need to bear that in mind, is when you're thinking about universal, it's universal to whom? Not necessarily to the whole globe, although you try to expand it to as large a market as you can, and take advantage of those elements. So for instance, now, most of the people in the world would have seen Avatar or any of those. Anything that makes a reference to Avatar or to The Simpsons, people would know that connection. But if you use something more specific, like something that is a character that is very famous exclusively in Thailand, then it would be really hard for all the rest of the world to understand what that refers to.
And who are the key cultural intermediaries in the transduction process, and how do their roles differ?
Well, basically the idea there is that people are the ones who have been taking mostly products from one place to another. So the first gatekeeper would always be someone who travels or who looks for a product elsewhere. So I was conceptualizing this in the idea of the scout, someone who goes and looks for something and says like, oh, this thing that I saw elsewhere would really work at home. An example that was very interesting is most of the morning radio shows in the 80s were basically because someone had traveled to the United States and had heard morning radio in the United States and said, oh, this format kind of would work. So a lot of the time it was copies. It was people traveling and saying, oh, I think this would work. I could try to buy it to bring it over and see if someone would like it. And because you were doing it that way, it tended to be easier, cheaper, or you could do it, you could just pirate it. You could just copy it and no one would notice. Because it was before you had a regulated market around it. Then you have people who dedicate markets, be the art market or be that the market for scripts or for getting the rights for a book to adapt into film or TV formats nowadays. And then you have people who say, okay, yes, you could try to copy my show and use some elements that are similar to my show, or I could sell you a guide with all the elements, with the brand name, and with my know-how on how to do the show. So what do you prefer? Yes, you could try to copy it and do it from scratch, and people would know it seems like a copy. Whereas if you buy it from me, I give you some extras that would make it successful for you. And what you have to do, and that's where the third person comes in, the transductor, you will have to transform it. You will have to transform it into something that works in your country, because the questions that are easy in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire might be totally different in one country than in the next. And it's funny because it's not with the tough questions. In general, the tough questions seem to be more common as tough questions for all over the world. But the basic ones, the entry ones, are the ones that are very specific and very local sometimes, because they're so simple that everyone around you would know. Something as simple as, what is the... You know that if you live in the country, you probably know the name of the anthem, or you can at least use some words. But if you don't, it's odd. Most people would not know either the name or how the anthem of another country goes. So, so it turns out that you need also at least those three types of people. One who goes and looks for things and says, those things are great, I could bring them over to the markets that I know. People who actually negotiate them, who sit down and tell you, okay, this would be better than this because you have this, or you can change that, or you would probably like this, or this would be a better price for you. who are the merchants, and the transductors, the people who engage with, okay, here is a product that you need to adapt to this market. So you have to come up with ways of doing it, whether you're adapting a script, whether you're translating, whether you're changing some of the elements so that they suit a certain way of consuming a product. That is what you do as a transductor. And on occasion, you have people who do all of those things at once. And they're not as common because we tend to specialize our knowledge rather than do all sorts of things, but you could have some of those as well.
Which metrics or indicators do you think best capture a successful transduction in like today's fragmented media environment?
Well, it would depend a lot on the type of product. I mean, you could think of success depends relative to the market that you would expect to reach. So when I was thinking about the case, as I mentioned, of Kingdom Rush, it was designed in Uruguay as a game that could be played on mobile phones, something that was not as common for the market that they were originally thinking about, their own local market. So they thought we should try to make it as global as possible. If you have for a game like that 100,000 to 1 million downloads, that is a big hit. That is, you manage to reach, because it's not that large a market. If you have the FMVs, the full motion video, so the interactive films that are done by a company in Wales, like Wales Interactive, you don't expect to reach 100,000 people. That's not what you expect. That's not your market. You might want to reach that level, but you're not expecting numbers in the million. Although you would like that, you know that not that many people are into interactive films. So your numbers would be lower than that. But what you really would expect is, for instance, to reach certain markets. So when I was talking to the people from I Don't Hide Games, at the moment they were like, we really would like to go into Asia. We want to go into South Korea, and we want to go into China. And we realized that for South Korea, we need to translate all the things. For China, we also need to have an internal distributor, because that's the way the market works. So you have to know the market, and if that's what you need to go through that. And obviously they want to make it even more appealing, so they created a character for that target group. So they said, we want to create a character that they would like more. So you could have metrics on whether that has worked, whether they would pick more the character that you customize for them or not. That's in the case of video games. In the case of TV formats, is how many countries do you manage to sell the format to? And there are really good examples. I think still Dori Media, which is partially Argentinian, has done a lot of really excellent work on that, managing to even sell a show not produced locally first. So they had it all written down and ready. They could not tell you this is already a hit, as most other shows would do, telling you it was already a hit here, maybe it will be a hit in your country. In this case, they were like, no, we have it. We know it's so good. We're going to produce it, but we can't give you how many people are going to get it now. But we're willing to sell it. They had an amazing marketing campaign. They did it one at NatP and MIPCOM and MIPTV, and they sold it at least 12 different countries, even before that had been produced in Argentina. So you didn't even need to show that it had been a hit. It was just like you believed in the product because the story you thought was really good, and you thought that it was so good that you could sell it to others, and others would also find it attractive.
Yeah.
So it had a good pitch, at least in that sense. So these are different ways in which you can look at it. I mean, there's some cases of very successful format and then some of the versions do really well, other versions don't do that well. Sometimes the companies are concerned that this would affect their brand. So it depends on whether they're going to adapt it. It's how much they try to pay attention to how it goes, because they want to make sure that their brand doesn't lose any value in the process. And with other cases, then you can just take a look at access or interest in the terms of webcomics, for instance, or if you're doing any other type of game that goes over online, you will just see how many people look at it. So obviously, within, as I said, the margin of what do you believe your market is. Yeah, you don't necessarily expect all of them to be multi-million-dollar products, but just that they reach a large enough market that it's worth keeping the product going.
Yeah. For the last question, I mean, you already mentioned a few of the aspects, but What practical advice would you give to small studios or like independent creators trying to break into foreign markets?
Right. One of the main things is just to consider, to see how well they know their market, the market they want to go into, and how wide are they going to make that market. That's a decision that they have to make and they have to know well enough. If you don't have the muscle to like just push through, which is what you can do if you have a massive corporation, then you can push your content through till people accept the way you do content and they like it. But you can't do that usually, so you have to be very careful at how you're gonna put your work into it. You can draw on things that are very local. So let's think about Squid Games or something like that. You can try to draw something that is very local and very recognizable, but you can't make that the whole thing. That cannot be the core of your product, because then people would not understand it and might not get into it.
You
need to provide them with enough elements that are kind of general, that you would be like, this could happen anywhere else, even though it's happening in this story in this place. And sometimes the way they do it is you don't dedicate too much time to describing the place. So if it's a place that you don't think people will necessarily notice, they've done this in film for many, many years, that you can showcase a city by filming in a different city. Or never mention what city it takes place in. You just think, oh, it's a generic city that has this and this and this elements. So you try to remove at least the most specific ones. And I remember this was told to me by someone selling formats from Argentina. And they were like, definitely we won't have people drinking mate, the traditional drink that Argentinians or Uruguayans would drink. Because in most of the world, they don't recognize that. They don't understand what people are doing. So you had to put down they're drinking tea. It's more likely that all over the world, people would understand someone drinking tea or coffee rather than drinking mate. So unless mate has a specific value to the story as part of the plot, then don't put it. Then put in another beverage. Because if not, it's going to distract people. It's going to make people worry about this that they don't understand. And many other very specific cultural elements that if you think the audience will not recognize, how are you going to make the audience understand it if it's relevant for the story? If not, then just remove it. So try to go really clearly and remove the things that do not add to the story and just make it complex. For instance, if something happens in a street and the name of a street is a very complicated name, then why don't you just give it the most simple name within the language, whatever language that is, but just use the most simple name, because they don't care if the street actually exists, but they just want to be able to pronounce it. So if you pick the real name, but the real name is unpronounceable for other languages, then that doesn't help. So those kind of things, those kind of little details to make sure that things are easy to understand to the audience and understand what they tend to like, or how they tend to like productions as well, how they like them to look like, what elements they seem to consume, because then you realize it's easier if you take advantage of what you know about the market to try to reach it. So it's knowing your market is always very useful, and making sure that your story is a central element as well, and not just be contaminated by a lot of things that you think are interesting or beautiful, but that might not add to the story, so they just distract. And obviously the main elements in many narratives would be love stories, family, conflict, obviously things that are kind of common to the stories that we tell.
Universe.
Yep.
Cool. Thank you so much for all the answers, and especially for the examples. It explained a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much again.
All right.
Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.